Yo, what is going on, guys? It is Nick here, back again with a brand new video today. We're going to be continuing my series which I review every single Sony Spider-Man Universe movie up to the release of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Today we're going to be reviewing The Amazing Spider-Man, which is directed by Mark Webb and came out in 2012. So first thing I want to talk about when it comes to The Amazing Spider-Man is the excellent casting all around. First off, we have Andrew Garfield, who is great in this movie. I wrote down that his Peter Parker isn't really as interesting as Tobey Maguire, and that is kind of the case. However, I think for the kind of nerd they were going for in this one, like, he plays a geeky 21st century high schooler pretty well, and he is a little bit younger looking than Tobey, so I actually do kind of buy him in this thing. His Peter Parker's not as interesting as Tobey, but I think for what he was going for, he did a good job. I think he's much better. He's awesome and very enjoyable as Spider-Man. I think when it comes to the actual just like persona of Spider-Man, who's quippy and funny and badass and does all the Spider-Man stuff, I think Andrew Garfield excels at the Spidey stuff, so I think that's why he does a great job in this movie. Emma Stone is also very good as Gwen Stacy. I like the fact that in this movie she's kind of more than just what they did with MJ in the Sam Raimi Spider movies, and she's much better than the Gwen Stacy in Spider-Man 3. If you guys saw my review for that, you guys know how I felt about that. Emma Stone's a lot more likable as Gwen Stacy than Bryce Dallas Howard is, and I think the writing for her character is better. She's more interesting, she's more likable, I think she's a better fit to Peter Parker than what people might give her credit for, honestly, because they kind of have the common interests and stuff. And one of the best things about these two actors is the on-screen chemistry between the two of them. The two actors were actually dating in real life when the scene took place, so that probably didn't hurt, you know, what was going on. But you really do buy them as a couple. You buy the fact that they're two people who have interests kind of similar to each other and who find each other attractive and want to date. And so I think that's one of the best things about this movie is the chemistry between Garfield and Stone. Martin Sheen is also pretty good as Uncle Ben. He's not as brilliant as Cliff Robertson, but I think for the script that they were given, I think Martin Sheen does a pretty good job at playing Uncle Ben. I actually do kind of buy him as the uncle to Peter. There's some things I kind of wish they would have done differently with him, but I think Sheen's performance is actually very good. And I wrote down that Sally Field is also pretty good as Aunt May. My kind of regret with her, though, is that she is a bit one-dimensional because she kind of just worries all the time. And there's actually like a deleted scene within like the Blu-ray of this movie where she's not so stressed out all the time. It's like one really nice scene between her and Peter that I kind of wish they would have left in because it would have added some more balance to her character. But you know, either way, Field's performance is very good. The dramatic act in this movie is very, very good. And I also wrote down that Rhys Ifans gives a great performance as Dr. Kirk Connors. I do have some issues with the writing errors that they did with the character, but I think that none of that can be blamed on Rhys Ifans. I think Rhys Ifans did a great job with the character, and he had a very compelling side to the character. Dennis Leary is also excellent as George Stacy. He's, I think, one of my favorite performances in the movie. Maybe my favorite, actually, behind Andrew Garfield. I think he does a great job in this movie. His character is kind of an interesting counterbalance to Spider-Man. It's like a character that you don't really see a whole lot in Spider-Man movies. I think it's cool that they had his character there. Some of the other stuff I like is that this movie is very well choreographed. There's some action sequences that just as a Spider-Man fan I think look great. There's some great moments where like the choreography and the way the camera works is just very interesting. And you kind of get to see some more like action Spidey stuff this time than I felt like you saw in the Raimi ones. I mean, the Raimi ones had action, but this one, because like the effects are, you know, later down the line, they actually were able to get some more impressive camera work and stuff. I think the choreography for this movie is very, very good. And this is also for the most part, a nice looking movie. I do have some issues with it, but I'll get to that later. But I think the movie looks nice. There's some interesting camera work. I like the choreography. There's some moments that seem very stylish, and I like those moments. Also, the film is very well edited. I like the editing of this film. There are some like montages and stuff that like typically would kind of annoy me, but I actually don't mind the montages in this movie. It kind of gives the movie some character, in my opinion. I think the editing for them is nice. And this movie also has a very good score from James Horner. May James Horner rest in peace. I don't think it's as good as Danny Elfman's score for the first two Spider-Man movies, but it is a pretty good score. I do think it works with the movie pretty well. I do like it within the sequences. And I think the score is pretty good for the most part. This movie also has a story that does an interesting job of making Spider-Man feel more realistic in a sense. I do air quotes because I know we're watching a movie about a guy who got spider powers, but I don't know, it does feel a little bit more grounded than the Raimi films. And although I love the Raimi films, and I do, they do feel more comic booky than this one, if you know what I mean. They feel like a little bit more cheesy, like it takes place in a fantasy world. Not that that's a bad thing, I love it, but this one does feel a little bit more grounded. It feels kind of like Spider-Man meets Batman Begins in a way. But I also like the fact that they also do keep some of the like imaginative fun with Spider-Man without making it too serious. It's not like a super, super dark movie. It's just a Spider-Man movie with some darker tones to it. There's a lot of moments in this film that I really do appreciate as a Spider-Man fan. I'm not going to go too deep into specifics, but there is one scene that I really want to talk about where I have it listed in my notes as the van scene. It's the scene where we're at the bridge and the Lizard is throwing cars over the bridge and Spider-Man is keeping them all attached by the webs. And there's this one scene where he goes down to this van with a kid stuck inside of it. And I really like that scene because within that scene there's a lot of connection that Andrew Garfield has with the kid in the van, where he even lets him wear the mask and tells him, like, you can do it, you just gotta pretend you're Spider-Man and get on up here, and he saves him from the van. It's such a nice scene. Like, those are scenes where I'm like, that's Spider-Man. Like, I know people might have some issues with the way they wrote Spider-Man, but whenever I see that, I'm like, no, that's classic Spider-Man right there. I thought they did that scene very well, and I think that's just, like, one scene that's a great example of, like, the multiple scenes that they do in this film that I just really appreciate as a Spider-Man fan. I also wrote down that Flash is kind of interesting. I'm not going to go deep into Flash because Flash is only in the movie for a few scenes, but we see him more in this one than we do in the original Spider-Man movie, and he's kind of more of a jock Flash than just a guy who picks on nerds kind of Flash. And what I find interesting about this one is that we see, like, the scene where Peter humiliates him, and it's kind of weird, kind of whatever. But I like the fact how, like, after the fact, whenever he finds out about what happened with Peter and Uncle Ben, he actually is nice to him, says, hey, I'm sorry to hear about that, and he's even, like, kind of messing with them in a fun, friendly way at the end of the movie. I don't know, kind of like the fact that Flash wasn't just some arrogant douchebag the whole way through. I like the fact that they actually gave him some more, like, I don't know, perspective to his character, I guess. This movie also does have some funny moments. There's some funny Spidey quips in the movie. The Raimi movies did have some, and they were, like, nice and laid out in different scenes, but I like the fact they didn't, like, overdo them because it does come off as a bit cocky and arrogant. This one has a few more Spidey quips, especially for one scene, but I just think it's kind of fun to see Spider-Man be a little bit more funny in this movie than we see in the previous films. And there's also some fun dialogue in the movie that I find funny. And this movie also has one of my favorite Stan Lee cameos. That's one of my favorite funny moments in the movie. I think aside from Stan Lee's cameo in Spider-Man 3, this is my favorite cameo that he's done in the Spider-Man movie. It's a fun scene, and it's like, you can just tell the writers, like, yeah, let's do that. That seems fun. And I like that they put that cameo in there. And although I do really like this movie for the most part, I do have some flaws. Then I have quite a few flaws listed. But unlike my Spider-Man 3 review, which, if you guys saw that, you guys know that I kind of just went in-depth with a lot of the flaws. I'm not going to go super in-depth on them. I kind of just want to pan through them kind of quickly. The first thing I wrote down is that it does recycle from Raimi's films a bit. And I also wrote down after that, it's not a bad thing, but there's a few times where they're trying a little bit too hard to be different. There's really kind of like two things in particular for me, is the with great power comes great responsibility scene. For whatever reason, the writers were just scared for Uncle Ben to just say that again. They had him say, like, a different version of that, just using different words, and it's just that thing for me where it's like, I don't really see what would have been a huge shame in just saying it again. I mean, there's always going to be things about Spider-Man, no matter how many times you remake it, that has to be there. You know, like, Spider-Man's always going to be a nerdy kid in high school, so I don't understand why they don't just keep with great power comes great responsibility in there. I don't know, it's kind of just like one thing where it's like they were trying a little bit too hard to be different with that. And I also wrote down show-off scenes. So there's like the scene on the basketball court that I mentioned, which, I mean, I'm okay with it because it's Peter standing up to the bully, but it's also a bit weird for his thing of Spider-Man, because it almost makes Spider-Man comes off a little bit more as, I want to humiliate the bully or whatever, which whenever it came to what happened in the original Spider-Man, it was an accident. Peter didn't mean for that to happen, as where in this one it was a lot more intentional. And it wasn't like necessarily the worst thing in the world, but I don't know, it's just kind of thing for me where I'm just like, I don't know if Spider-Man has to be such a show-off. Or Peter Parker, I mean, I don't feel like Peter Parker needs to be as much of a show-off in this scene. There's also that scene where he throws the ball and it just like dents the football goal thing, and it's just that thing for me where it's like, it's kind of a weird scene. I know it's funny, but it's also just that thing where it's like, is it ever going to occur to anyone that kid might not be normal? I mean, he jumped like he was Spider-Man, because he was Spider-Man, onto the basketball thing, and he also dented a giant football goal by throwing a football by accident. It's like, I mean, it's a funny scene, but just that kind of thing where it's like, did they really need to do that? I don't know. Just it gets kind of messy. I don't know. It's just something I felt when I watched this movie. I also wrote down that the Lizard is mostly good, but it has some development problems. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said that I really like Rhys Ifans' performance as the character. It's just that there's some story elements to it that I felt kind of mess up with the development, because the thing is that he's very humanized before he becomes the Lizard, and I like that, but then once he turns into Lizard, he starts to get like the voices in his head, kind of like Norman Osborn, and all of a sudden he feels less human, and I kind of feel like it kind of makes the Lizard feel a little bit more ridiculous than he needed to. And I also find it weird how his motive for the whole thing is to turn the whole city into lizards. And what I actually wrote down is that I actually checked out the deleted scenes before doing this review, because I wanted to make sure that I knew as much as I did. And there's a handful of deleted scenes that could have actually helped with the story. We see a scene where he's actually struggling with who he is after the first time he becomes the Lizard, which I feel like adds some, I don't know, more side to that, to him once after he becomes the Lizard. There's also a scene with Kirk Connors and his son where I'm just like, hey, there's something that kind of makes him a little bit more human. This is like after he's become the lizard, because he shifts in between lizard and human. And there's also a scene later on where we see him go back into his human form in the bathroom. There's another deleted scene, and I felt like that could have added something to the movie. And there's also one more scene I want to talk about involving the actor Irfan Khan, who was a very famous actor in India, and he died a few years ago. May he rest in peace. He has a few scenes in this movie with Kurt Connors, and then we see him at the bridge scene. Never see him again, but there is a deleted scene where we actually see his character get some closure, and not only do we see his character get some closure, but we actually learn more about why the lizard wants to turn everybody into lizards. These are just deleted scenes that I can understand why maybe they would want to cut them out for time, because they don't want the movie to get too long, but I feel like had they left them in, you wouldn't have had as many people complaining about the lizard as they did, because there would have been more perspective. It's just that thing where it's like, of all the things you could cut out, I don't feel like you needed to cut those out. So those are just some deleted scenes I felt like could have really improved the story with the lizard a little bit. And I also wrote down that there's some abandoned storylines. So when it comes to the death of Uncle Ben, I know that people complain about how it repeats Spider-Man 1, and I get that, but that's not really my complaint with it. My complaint with it is that we see Peter go on a revenge mission to try and find the killer for Uncle Ben, and he kind of learns how to be Spider-Man through this. And then they kind of just abandon that plot line. We never see what happens with that. We never see any closure to that storyline. We never see Peter find the guy. We never get any closure for any of that. And so it's kind of that thing for me where it's like, you almost had something like really great with it, but you kind of ruined it by just abandoning the plot line. It's kind of the thing for me where it's like, I feel like it would have been more satisfying if Peter maybe eventually found the guy, or if there was maybe a scene or something where Peter was like, you know what, I was mad at this guy, but I'll leave it behind me because I have a greater responsibility to do, then yeah, that could have helped it out. But there's no closure to the scene. I kind of just felt like, I don't know, that's an abandoned storyline that kind of just like messes with it a little bit, if you know what I mean. I also wrote down there's also abandoned storylines with Peter's parents, because you learn a little bit about Peter's parents and why he left him, but not a whole lot. And I know that they were setting this up for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which we'll get a review of that next week, but I kind of just wish they would have talked about it a little bit more, because kind of the thing where it's like they're setting it up for more setup. I don't know, it's just kind of messy to me. And the last few things I want to talk about is I wrote down that there's some issues with the film's directing style. I mean, so I think the film looks pretty nice for the most part, but it does have an odd color palette at times. There's a lot of scenes that take place at night, and Spider-Man's suit in this movie is also rather dark, so it's kind of just the thing where it's like, I don't know why they felt the need to have so many dark scenes where, like, it's kind of just shadows and stuff. I mean, it doesn't necessarily look bad. It's kind of a thing where I'm just like, why? Because even the night scenes in Raimi's films had a distinct style to them, or even they had like something about it that made it pop a little bit more. So that's something about it that feels kind of weird. And I wrote down this film does have a little bit of an off-kilter directing style at times. It struggles to find its footing. So you guys might notice a very awkward edit or transition right now. While I was recording, my SD card ran out of memory, so I had to go move all my footage from my SD card to my hard drive, and that's all resolved now. But what I was trying to say before my camera cut off was that this film kind of has a bit of an off-kilter directing style, and prior to The Amazing Spider-Man, Mark Webb had only directed one feature film at this point called 500 Days of Summer. Very good movie. I love that movie. I highly recommend checking it out if you have not seen it. It's a very good romantic comedy, and it's pretty well directed too. But with this one, it's kind of interesting because this was Mark Webb's first time directing a superhero movie, and he only had one feature director credit prior to this movie, so I can kind of forgive the fact that this film does have a bit of a hard time finding its own footing in the sense of finding a unique directing style. You know, because this is a good-looking movie, I feel like, aside from some of the dark shots that I previously talked about, and it's very well edited and stuff, but it kind of just lacks a unique style. Like, if you watch the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, those felt like Sam Raimi films and had a very unique directing style. This is that thing where I feel like Mark Webb was still kind of finding his footing, still kind of figuring out how to make a cohesive directing style, and so I feel like whenever he directed the movie, I feel like afterwards he probably watched the movie back and was like, oh, that directing style was not as good as I hoped it would be, or maybe like it wasn't as like unique as he hoped it would be. When like that stuff happens, I mean, I'm not gonna go and bash or grill a director whose directing experience is only so limited, you know. So that's just kind of one of the complaints I have, is the fact that this film does have a bit of a hard time having a unique directing style at moments. There's some very well directed sequences, don't get me wrong, and there's some great camera work and visuals, but overall this film does feel a bit clunky and a bit uneven in terms of its directing style. And the last thing I have written down in my complaints is the Spider-Man suit in this movie. Personally, I don't really have any big issues with the Spider-Man suit. I think it looks alright, but I can understand why some people wouldn't like it because, as I mentioned, we have a lot of scenes that take place in the dark, and so it's kind of weird to have a dark-looking Spider-Man suit whenever you're like in a dark scene, which is a bit strange, and it also kind of looks a little bit like a basketball. And so I can see why some people maybe wouldn't like it. I mean, I think the suit looks alright to me. I respect the fact they didn't just want to rip off Toby's suit and they wanted to make something new and a bit more, I guess, tangible, maybe a bit more realistic and darker and stuff. Like, I can respect that they want to do something different. I just don't feel like the way in which they did it was the most satisfying way. And for me, the biggest, like, downside when it came to the suit wasn't even necessarily the fact that it looks kind of like a basketball or the fact that it had dark colors. For me, it was, like, the dark yellow eye pieces that almost look kind of orange or gold. Because those, like, colors are not what come to mind when I think of Spider-Man. And I don't know, it just kind of feels weird to have that in a movie, especially when there's a lot of scenes that take place at night. And so that's kind of like the big misstep, in my opinion, that they did with the suit, was giving him yellow eyes. Like, I don't think it looks horrible, but I'm just like, it doesn't entirely work for me. But, you know, that's just one of those complaints to me where it's like, I can overlook it because I enjoy most of the movie, but, you know, it's just kind of the thing for me where I kind of wish that the suit was a little bit more visually appealing. So overall, I do really like The Amazing Spider-Man. I think it definitely has some flaws as I've gone into. It definitely could have had some better writing. It could have been executed a little bit better. There's some story moments that don't always work out. There's some story elements that don't entirely work. There's some, you know, abandoned storylines I don't entirely care for, and there's some things I feel like they probably could have done a little bit better. And it is a bit repetitive of Raimi's film to a certain degree, but I do think it is an enjoyable movie. I don't think it's necessarily an amazing Spider-Man movie, despite what its title suggests. I think it's a pretty good Spider-Man movie. I think it is mostly great. It's not perfect, but I do, for the most part, still really enjoy it. I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10 because despite some of the frustrating moments, I do have a fun time with this movie, and I can sit back and watch and go, this is a fun movie. And I'm going to give it an overall grade of an A- because, you know, it's definitely not as great as the Raimi films, especially the first two. I think this movie is a little bit of an improvement over Spider-Man 3, however. The film is a bit messy, and it could have been better at certain points. There could have been some writing stuff they could have done differently. They could have not deleted so many scenes, but I think overall it's a good Spider-Man movie. I think it's a great movie. So I think when it comes to like the actual structure of the movie, it's mostly great. But I think as a Spider-Man movie, it's not a great Spider-Man movie, but it's a good Spider-Man movie. And not everything about it works out, but I enjoy it enough and I can appreciate it. So that's my review of The Amazing Spider-Man. I hope you guys enjoyed the review. You can tune to my channel next week for my review of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. That's going to be a very interesting movie to review. If you guys haven't seen my reviews for the other Spider-Man movies I did the MCU Spider-Man movies that I did when I did my MCU reviews, and as well as the Raimi trilogy, so you can click on the playlist somewhere on the screen so you can go check that out. Thank you as always for watching the video. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And also make sure that you go to the description and check out my links there so you can follow me on Twitch, Instagram, and TikTok. That's going to be it for the video today, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure that you hit the like button, hit the subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified about latest videos. Leave a comment down below, let me know what you think. And yeah, it's been it. Peace.